The Gulf Stream that Evan Ror had spent 6 long weeks rebuilding sat shining beneath the hangar lights. Yet when he laid the invoice on the conference table, the executives only laughed and announced they had no intention of paying him. They believed a struggling single father drowning in debt would remain silent rather than risk damaging his reputation. Evan didn't argue. He quietly removed his certification card from his pocket, placed it beside the hangar key, and walked away without another word. 10 minutes later, Vivian Ashcraft ordered the aircraft prepared for departure. But every pilot who approached the jet reacted the same way. They opened the maintenance logbook, reviewed the entries, stepped back, and refused. Without Evan's signature, the aircraft wasn't leaving the ground. If you believe honesty and integrity always matter, stay until the end and watch the truth finally take flight. Cold rain continued sweeping across the tarmac at Blackridge Executive Airfield when Evan drove his truck through the security gate. It was the kind of Carolina rain that blew sideways and made everything outdoors feel temporary. 3 hours earlier, he had received a call from Miles Voss, operations director for Ashcraft Meridian Holdings. Miles described the situation in 4 short, clipped sentences, as if summarizing a memo. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G550, once owned by the late Conrad Ashcraft. It had been grounded for almost 2 years following a combined electrical and hydraulic failure that had never been properly documented, and apparently had never been a priority to repair. 3 major maintenance companies had quoted wait times stretching into months, and Miles explained that months were something the company simply did not have. A merger would be finalized in 6 weeks, and the aircraft had to be flight-ready before then. Evan asked only 2 questions: when the aircraft had last undergone maintenance and what condition the hydraulic lines were in. Then he agreed to inspect it before making any commitment. What he discovered inside Hangar 7 made him pause beneath the beam of his flashlight. The Gulfstream wasn't merely grounded. Someone had worked on it carelessly. The person responsible seemed to understand the layout of an aircraft but not the engineering principles behind it. Worse, the repair work had been abandoned midway through, as though the mechanic had suddenly walked away for something more urgent or more convenient. Wire bundles had been disconnected and left hanging. A hydraulic accumulator had been replaced with a unit carrying no traceable part number. Entire sections of maintenance records covering nearly 30 months of operation were missing. Evan had seen neglected maintenance before. He had encountered operators who stretched service intervals and trusted luck more than procedure. But this felt different. It looked as though someone had intentionally made the aircraft difficult to audit. 20 minutes later, Miles Voss arrived wearing a suit worth more than Evan's monthly bank payment. With the confidence of someone accustomed to getting immediate agreement, he outlined the terms. The contract included labor, parts, and a completion bonus if the aircraft was delivered on schedule. He quoted the figure aloud in a tone designed to sound generous rather than negotiable. Evan requested every maintenance record available, including third-party service orders. Miles replied that someone would gather whatever records could be found, which wasn't quite the same as confirming the records actually existed. Before leaving, Miles reminded him that the goal was simply to get the aircraft flying again, that previous repairs only needed finishing, and that paperwork shouldn't interfere with practical results. Evan was inspecting the forward avionics bay when another set of footsteps echoed through the hangar. Looking up, he saw Vivian Ashcraft standing near the entrance, her coat still damp from the rain. She was 38 years old and carried the calm composure of someone trained since childhood never to appear unsettled. She studied him with the skepticism of a person who had heard too many professional opinions and stopped trusting most of them. She asked whether he could accomplish what larger firms had declined. Evan rose slowly, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and answered that he couldn't promise the aircraft would be ready within 6 weeks. He could only promise that it would not leave the hangar until it was safe. Vivian regarded him for a moment, uncertain whether his response was a warning or a refusal. Then she turned and disappeared back into the rain without another word. Later, while locking his truck, Evan received a call from Nora. Her voice carried that familiar blend of curiosity and concern teenagers use when they want answers without sounding worried. He told her the project was larger than expected and promised to keep her updated. He didn't mention the foreclosure notice waiting on his desk at home or the shrinking amount of patience remaining at the bank. Driving away from Blackridge, he knew two things. The job was at least 3 times larger than Miles had described, and he desperately needed every dollar the contract promised. Neither fact would change his standards. The next major discovery came when he removed a panel beneath the primary avionics rack. Hidden inside was a component installed where an entirely different one should have been. The serial number matched no manufacturer's catalog he had ever seen. More troubling, it controlled the aircraft's directional flight surfaces. The following morning, Lena Brooks arrived carrying a case full of diagnostic equipment and wearing the expression she reserved for jobs she already suspected would be worse than advertised. She and Evan had worked together for 11 years. She understood his process the way musicians understand a conductor's rhythm, and she immediately recognized that an unregistered serial number on a flight control component was not a paperwork mistake. It pointed either to incompetence or something far more serious. They recruited 2 additional certified technicians and divided the aircraft into sections. Methodically, they cataloged every irregularity, every undocumented repair, and every part that failed to match official records. Within the first week, Miles began delaying approvals for replacement parts. In response, Evan dipped into his personal line of credit and purchased critical components himself: hydraulic seals, wiring harness sections, and a pressurization controller the aircraft urgently required. Every time Evan submitted a report detailing new failures discovered during inspections, Miles acknowledged them in language that minimized the findings, presenting safety concerns as minor inconveniences. Meanwhile, the reports reaching Vivian were edited into brief summaries, portraying Evan as behind schedule and over budget. On the 9th day, Vivian called the hangar to question the slow pace. Evan explained that progress depended on what inspections revealed, not on anyone's assumptions. He invited her to review every unedited report personally. That afternoon she arrived and found him lying beneath a wiring conduit, dismantling a connector because the torque felt wrong. She watched silently as he worked. When he finally showed her the connector, she saw that an internal contact had been bent in a way that would pass visual inspection, yet eventually trigger intermittent autopilot failures. She never apologized for doubting him, but she didn't repeat her criticism either. For perhaps the first time, she noticed that Evan seemed completely indifferent to her status as the person paying him, a quality she rarely encountered and wasn't sure whether she admired or disliked. Meanwhile, Lena continued investigating the mysterious serial number. On day 12, she found the answer. The component originated from a supplier called Vanguard Aerosupply, a company established only 3 years earlier. Despite its short history, it had sold more than $4 million worth of aviation components to Ashcraft Meridian. Every purchase order, approval signature, and payment authorization traced back to one individual. Lena quietly printed the records and handed them to Evan without commentary, exactly as she always delivered discoveries that changed everything. While recalibrating cockpit instrumentation, Evan noticed a photograph tucked into the pilot's seat pocket. It showed Conrad Ashcraft standing beside the aircraft with a teenage Vivian on a bright tarmac, both squinting against sunlight. He carefully returned the photograph to its exact position. Nearby sat a small mechanical clock with a cracked crystal, untouched by previous technicians. Evan cleaned it gently before continuing his work. When Lena later informed him that the unregistered component governed directional flight control, the significance became undeniable. Failure at that location could leave a pilot unable to steer the aircraft. The next morning, Evan formally requested replacement of the entire flight control assembly. Before noon, Miles rejected the request. The merger schedule, he argued through Vivian's assistant, could not accommodate a complete replacement. Furthermore, the installed component had supposedly been approved by a certified engineer whose documentation was already on file. Evan reviewed the records and discovered the engineer had left the company 14 months before the approval date, appearing beside his signature. Someone had forged the sign-off. He photographed the discrepancy, documented it privately, and kept working. Because people who falsify records rarely stop once suspicion begins, they accelerate. 3 days later, Evan discovered that an addendum to his contract had been altered. The delivery date, previously listed as a target, had been transformed into a mandatory deadline. Attached to it was a penalty clause allowing Ashcraft Meridian to withhold final payment if the aircraft missed the date. Evan had never approved the revision. He retrieved the original email records and archived both versions together. That night, Vivian arrived at the hangar exhausted and visibly frustrated. Miles had informed her that Evan was intentionally delaying completion to demand additional money. He claimed Evan was using delays as leverage and suggested legal action if he failed to comply. Standing between her and the aircraft, Evan listened without interruption. Then he retrieved a single bolt from his toolbox and placed it on the workbench. He instructed Vivian to compare it with the specifications listed on the latest Vanguard Aerosupply invoice. The bolt came from the aircraft's directional control linkage. The invoice described an entirely different component. Vivian stared at both items in silence. 15 minutes later, Miles appeared. Someone had clearly contacted him. He explained that minor part substitutions were common industry practice, and insisted Evan was exaggerating routine procurement differences to create the appearance of a safety issue. He delivered the explanation with the polished ease of someone who had rehearsed versions of it many times before. Then, speaking quietly enough that Vivian would struggle to hear, he reminded Evan that a man facing foreclosure was poorly positioned to fight a corporation backed by 40 attorneys. Evan simply nodded and returned to work. That night he duplicated every photograph, report, and data file onto 3 separate drives stored in 3 different locations. Later, Vivian returned alone carrying 2 coffees. They sat together on maintenance stairs and spoke not about the aircraft but about life. She asked about Nora. He said his daughter was ready for a fresh start somewhere new. He asked how long her father had owned the jet. She replied that she could not remember a time when he hadn't. The next morning, every Vanguard Aerosupply record had vanished from the company server. The deletion only confirmed their suspicions. Fortunately, Lena had anticipated it and already copied the relevant directories to an encrypted drive. Over the following days, she cross-referenced invoices, serial numbers, and installation dates, while Evan sourced a legitimate flight control assembly from a salvage facility in Tennessee, verified its certification history, and paid the deposit himself because Miles had effectively frozen significant expenditures. The final 2 weeks were not dramatic. System integration tests, calibration procedures, ground power checks, careful verification that every repaired system communicated correctly with every other. Yet everyone understood the significance. Someone had previously cut corners on this aircraft. The consequences, however, would fall on whoever signed it off. When the engines finally started, The sound echoed through the hangar floor and walls. Two technicians stopped working simply to listen. Lena allowed herself one quiet breath of satisfaction before returning to her clipboard. Vivian arrived unannounced while the auxiliary power unit was running. For a moment she remained at the entrance, gathering herself before approaching. Then she stepped forward and placed her hand against the fuselage. Recognizing the gesture, Evan said nothing. When she thanked him, her voice carried something deeper than professional gratitude. Miles, meanwhile, remained focused on schedules. Even before final inspections were complete, he insisted the aircraft would enter flight operations the next morning because the merger timeline demanded it. Evan answered that inspection schedules were dictated by safety, not business deadlines. That evening, without Evan's knowledge, Miles instructed a technician to place old Vanguard components inside hangar storage, where they could later be portrayed as unauthorized parts supplied by Evan. The technician obeyed without question. The next morning, Evan submitted his final invoice. $240,000 covering labor, approved parts, personal expenditures, and the completion bonus outlined in the original agreement. Before lunch, Miles met with the company's legal department. Afterward, Evan received notice that final payment would be withheld pending investigation into alleged contract violations. The accusations centered on a deadline he never accepted and components he never purchased. Miles personally delivered the decision. Standing in the hangar doorway, he informed Evan that Ashcraft Meridian would not be paying. Then he offered a smaller private payment in exchange for a signed airworthiness certificate. Evan set the hangar key on the workbench. He kept his certification card. Then he calmly informed Miles that while the company owned the aircraft, nobody present had the authority to declare it safe for flight, except the qualified person responsible for the inspection. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Vivian arrived expecting departure by 9 o'clock. Miles had assured her the situation was resolved, that Evan had walked away over money, and that another technician would complete the certification. She entered the terminal, believing the problem was behind them. What she didn't know was that Captain Grant Hale had already been in the hangar since 7:30. Grant was 55 years old. He had flown Conrad Ashcraft across 6 continents and possessed the quiet authority earned through decades of experience. He opened the maintenance logbook, reviewed Evan's notes, saw the absence of a final airworthiness certification, and closed the book. His decision was immediate. When Miles insisted certification would arrive later and urged him to begin pre-flight procedures, Grant replied that he would begin pre-flight when certification existed, and not before. Miles contacted the backup first officer. The first officer asked one question: had Evan Ror cleared the aircraft? When Miles admitted he had not, the officer declined the assignment. 2 contract pilots were then offered double their normal rates. The first refused as soon as he learned the aircraft lacked final sign-off. The second arrived at the field, reviewed the maintenance records, read Evan's notation regarding the unresolved control assembly issue, and drove away without entering the building. Frustrated, Vivian finally asked Grant directly why he would not fly. Grant told her about a morning years earlier when he arrived to find a young maintenance technician refusing to allow Conrad Ashcraft aboard the aircraft because of a fuel feed irregularity Conrad had dismissed as insignificant. An issue Evan had recorded across 3 pages of handwritten notes, a defect that was later verified by the manufacturer as a recognized flaw capable of leading to engine failure during flight operations. Conrad had been outraged, had threatened Evan's employment in front of others, and accused him of exceeding the limits of his authority. 2 weeks afterward, Conrad sent Evan a letter, Grant admitted he had never personally read it, but had heard it discussed, and said that from that point forward, Conrad trusted Evan's signature because he had witnessed the price Evan was willing to pay for refusing to give it improperly. Miles suggested bringing in an outside inspector to approve the certificate quickly. 3 inspectors were contacted, and every one of them responded with the same conclusion. When a technician with Evan Ror's reputation documented an open technical discrepancy in a maintenance record, no responsible inspector would approve it without seeing the issue physically corrected. The discrepancy Evan entered was detailed, documented, and referenced a component serial number that could not be verified. It was the type of notation that could not simply be ignored without inspecting the part itself. The merger deadline was drawing closer. A financial publication raised questions about whether Ashcroft Meridian's leadership transition was progressing as planned. Before noon, the board had already sent Vivian 3 messages. Miles insisted that Evan was holding the company hostage for additional money, and she stood in the terminal looking out at the aircraft parked on the tarmac, thinking about the bolt Evan had set on the toolbox and the mismatched part numbers. Then she walked back into the hangar by herself. She opened the small private compartment hidden behind the co-pilot's seat, a cabinet Conrad had always kept locked. Inside, beneath a folded navigation chart, she found a sealed envelope bearing a name written in her father's handwriting, Evan Ror. The letter contained 4 handwritten paragraphs on Ashcroft Meridian stationery and was dated 3 years before Conrad's death. It had been written after a maintenance review Conrad described as an experience that forced him to recognize something he had long chosen to overlook. The tone was personal rather than corporate. It read like the thoughts of a man preparing to act, though still uncertain about when. Conrad wrote that the only reason aircraft in his fleet remained airworthy was because certain people within the maintenance chain refused to treat their professional signature as a formality, understanding that certification existed not merely to confirm work had been completed, but to ensure it had been completed correctly. He stated that such individuals were inconvenient, costly, and absolutely indispensable, and that any operation willing to pressure them into compromise had already started failing, whether anyone recognized it or not. The second item in the compartment was a small voice recorder. When Vivian pressed play, her father's voice filled the cabin with a presence that felt both unsettling and comforting at once, too immediate, too real, bringing back someone who had been gone for 18 months. The recording captured a discussion between Conrad and Miles roughly 8 weeks before Conrad's death. In it, Conrad calmly asked a question in the patient tone he used whenever he already suspected the answer, and was giving someone a chance to be honest before he uncovered it himself. He wanted to know why the aviation division's maintenance expenses had risen by 31% over 3 years despite no increase in fleet size or flight activity. Miles offered an explanation that sounded polished, detailed, and reasonable. Conrad replied that he understood, but near the end of the recording, he stated that upon returning from an upcoming international trip, he intended to launch a full audit of every third-party vendor relationship connected to the aviation division. The recording stopped there. Conrad never returned from that trip. Vivian drove to Ror Airworks and arrived to find a foreclosure notice posted on the front entrance, and Evan inside packing tools into crates with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that standing still would solve nothing. She told him about the letter and the recording. She informed him she was ready to release payment immediately and asked him to return and finish the certification. Evan placed the wrench he was holding on the bench and explained that his signature covered the entire aircraft, including components installed before his arrival, and that payment could not alter the origin of a flight control part linked to no legitimate source. She asked what was required. He answered that he needed an independent inspection authority completely separate from Ashcroft Meridian's procurement chain, a full traceability review of every flight-critical component, and full payment for his team regardless of the audit's outcome. He said the issue was not the work he had completed, but the work done before him, work someone had attempted to conceal within his own repairs. He spread documents across a workbench, serial number records, Vanguard invoices, forged engineering approvals, server deletion timestamp logs, and the original contract beside its altered version. Vivian spent 20 minutes reading while he continued packing. She admitted she had signed the payment hold order. Evan said he already knew. She waited for anger or resentment, but none came. Instead, he simply asked whether she had reviewed the same information he had seen from the beginning or only the version Miles wanted her to see. Looking over the evidence laid out before her, she realized the two versions were completely different. She picked up her phone and called the chairman of the board. Vivian did not confront Miles that evening. She had watched him long enough to understand that confronting him before securing the evidence would only encourage him to erase what remained. She informed the chairman only that she was initiating an internal audit and needed 48 hours. Through whatever channels Miles maintained within the boardroom, he learned she was slowing the process. Mistaking it for hesitation, he acted quickly. He ordered the removal of stored Vanguard components from the hangar and arranged transport to an off-site facility. Lena, who had access to the independent auditor's tracking system, noticed the shipping manifest and flagged it. The auditors intercepted the shipment at a warehouse owned by an LLC whose only listed officer happened to be Miles Voss's brother-in-law. Inside, investigators discovered 312 components across 17 categories. None possessed valid airworthiness certification. Many carried counterfeit manufacturer markings. All were connected to Ashcroft Meridian billing records dating back 4 years. The average markup exceeded 260% compared with legitimate certified parts. Miles had prepared for scrutiny in a courtroom where documents could be interpreted and timelines challenged. He had not prepared for questions in a conference room where Vivian Ashcroft sat at the head of the table, holding the voice recorder recovered from her father's aircraft. He delivered the explanation he had rehearsed. The components, he claimed, were legitimate alternatives acquired through unconventional supply channels. The prices reflected urgent availability. He further alleged that Ror Airworks had itself installed unauthorized parts, the very components currently sitting in hangar storage. He made the accusation confidently because he personally arranged for those parts to be placed there. Evan responded with the hangar's access logs. Every entry was time-stamped, including the visit by Miles's technician the previous evening, hours after Evan had submitted his invoice. The parts arrived after the invoice. Evan's installation records documented every component actually installed on the aircraft, complete with supporting paperwork. The difference between what Miles deposited and what had truly been installed created a gap Miles could not explain without accounting for the midnight visit. Miles shifted tactics and appealed directly to the board, reminding them that Evan had been dismissed from a larger company 7 years earlier, that his business had experienced contract disputes, and that financial hardship gave him a motive to fabricate a crisis. Evan acknowledged the termination and pointed out that the reason was publicly documented. He had refused to certify a batch of components purchased from an unapproved supplier, declined requests to alter his report, and lost his job as a result. 11 months later, following a federal aviation investigation, that company recalled the entire batch. The recall documents were already included on page 12 of the board materials. Miles had no response to page 12. Vivian suspended Miles pending investigation, approved immediate payment, and authorized a complete procurement audit. Then the auditors uncovered a detail that changed everything. The same category of suspect component Lena had identified on the Gulfstream had also been installed on 2 other aircraft in Ashcroft Meridian's private fleet, both of which had flown dozens of times over the previous 18 months. Before the board meeting ended, Vivian grounded the entire fleet. She made the decision personally and called flight operations from the conference room. The grounding was confirmed within a minute. The choice created major financial consequences. Executive travel plans were canceled, international meetings had to be rescheduled, and the disruption would inevitably attract attention from financial journalists. 3 board members argued she was overreacting. Vivian replied that overreacting would mean replacing every questionable component with verified safe parts before the next departure, and she would gladly debate any other interpretation after inspections were finished. That evening, Miles submitted a voicemail resignation, wrapped in language about serving the company's best interests. Beneath the wording was an obvious implication. A quiet resignation was preferable to an investigation, and certain details could remain hidden if the matter was treated as a personnel issue. Vivian forwarded the voicemail to outside counsel and instructed them to coordinate with federal aviation authorities. Over the next 2 days, Evan and Lena examined the remaining aircraft with the same meticulous process they had applied to the Gulfstream. They found the same class of components in both flight control systems, the same Vanguard origin, the same absence of traceable certification, and the same installation pattern during poorly documented maintenance periods. Neither aircraft had yet suffered a failure, likely because they flew less frequently. But Evan's inspection notes clearly outlined what a failure at cruising altitude would look like, and why pilots would receive little to no warning before it became catastrophic. Several board members suggested Evan was using the situation to secure a long-term contract, and that his refusal to certify the aircraft until every component was verified was a negotiation tactic rather than a professional duty. Evan responded by offering his resignation from the project once all documentation had been delivered to the independent auditors. The room fell silent because nobody expected that answer. He explained that his interest was not financial. The pilots operating those aircraft and every passenger they had carried were innocent of the decisions that endangered them. They deserved the same level of scrutiny every aircraft deserved before someone placed their signature on a certificate. Vivian authorized full payment of $240,000, plus late payment interest and reimbursement for every personal expense Evan's team had advanced during the project. She signed the authorization in front of the board, auditors, and Evan's crew. She did not request a confidentiality agreement because Evan had already made it clear he would never sign one. The merger Miles had fought to preserve collapsed once the acquiring company's due diligence team discovered the fleet grounding. By then, Vivian had already concluded that any merger dependent on concealing a safety liability was not a transaction worth completing. During the final inspection of the Gulfstream's control assembly, Evan discovered a wear groove inside the linkage housing, deep, distinct, and entirely consistent with the slow failure pattern of an improperly rated component under sustained stress. Had the aircraft departed the morning Vivian ordered it airborne, the first symptoms likely would have appeared somewhere over Virginia, at altitude, far from any available runway. The groove was photographed, measured, and included in the final report without exaggeration. Its existence confirmed what Evan had suspected from the first night. Reviewing the aircraft's maintenance history, he saw the truth clearly. Someone had chosen speed over verification, and the distance between schedule and disaster had been far smaller than anyone in the executive offices realized.